day, everybody, and welcome back to our reading of the American Revolution, The Road to Independence. Today we are on Chapter 6, From Valley Forge to Yorktown. I spoke to your teacher last night and she told me that you guys know something about these battles, so I'm excited to read this to you. Today we're trying to find out what European country joined the Continental Army to fight the British, and how did their help influence the outcome of the war. Remember, if you don't want to hear me read, you can always find the book on the Google Classroom, or the audiobook is on the Google Classroom as well. Today, Chapter 6, sit back, relax, and here we go. Chapter 6, From Valley Forge to Yorktown. There is a saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was a difficult time for Washington and his men. Those who survived that winter in Valley Forge came to think they were strong enough to survive just about anything. In February 1778, the French military entered the war to fight alongside the Continental Army. France was a longtime enemy of Great Britain, so they welcomed the opportunity to assist the colonists in their fight against the British. This was good news for the colonists. France had a strong, organized military. French involvement meant help was on the way. Then, in late February, a man with a heavy German accent arrived in Valley Forge. His name was Frederick Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustine von Steuben. The purpose for his arrival began during the previous summer when von Steuben traveled to Paris to volunteer his service to the Count de Saint-Germain, the French Minister of War. Saint-Germain had been so impressed with von Steuben's military experience that he sent him across the Atlantic Ocean to meet George Washington. George Washington was equally impressed and asked von Steuben to train his soldiers. There was just one problem. Von Steuben only knew a few words of English, so he shouted his commands in German. Then someone would translate the words into English. Von Steuben taught the Continental soldiers how to march and stand in formation. He taught them how to advance on the battlefield. He also taught them how to use the bayonets attached to their muskets. Von Steuben trained a model company. Then the members of this model company trained other companies. Things began to improve in the spring of 1778. Washington sent out foraging parties to gather cattle, horses, corn, hay, and grains from the local people. They returned with enough food to feed the soldiers at Valley Forge. Washington also appointed a new quartermaster whose job was to make sure the army did not run out of food or supplies. And last but not least, Washington convinced the Continental Congress to send more money and to recruit more soldiers. By the time the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they were much better prepared to fight as an army. The newly trained Continental Army began to win more battles. Their first decisive victory came in the fall of 1781. At this point, much of the fighting had shifted south to Virginia and the Carolinas. British troops in the south were led by Lord Cornwallis. The beginning of the end. In August 1781, Cornwallis and his men camped at Yorktown in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. They were waiting for reinforcements and supplies. While Cornwallis was setting up camp in Yorktown, Washington was meeting with several French generals outside New York City. The French had sent thousands of troops out to assist Washington. Now Washington and the French generals had to decide how to best utilize these new troops. Should they attack the British in New York City, or should they head south and attack Cornwallis in Virginia? Eventually, they decided to march the main Continental Army and most of the French troops south to Virginia and to try and trap Cornwallis. But Washington was crafty. He sent out fake messages to make the British think he was actually going to attack New York. The British were fooled by the messages. In late September, Washington arrived at Yorktown with 4,000 French soldiers and 3,000 Continental soldiers. The Major General of the Continental Army was the Marquis de Lafayette. These new soldiers reinforced Lafayette's men who were already there. The French Navy arrived as well, and one of the first things they did was drive away a convoy of British ships that were carrying supplies for Cornwallis and his men. That was when Cornwallis knew he was in trouble. He was cornered by the French and the Continental armies, and the French Navy had cut off his escape route as well as his supplies. Excuse me. The French and Continental armies set up cannons and began firing on the British. For days, the guns fired constantly. Washington gave orders to fire through the night so the British would not have any quiet time to rest or make repairs. Cornwallis and his men could not protect themselves, and because of the position of the French fleet, they could not sail away. Eventually, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis accepted that he had no choice but to surrender. Thousands of people who lived in nearby towns and villages came out to watch the official surrender. The Continental Army lined up on one side of the road and the French on the other. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the British Army marched between the lines of French and Continental troops to surrender. James Thatcher of Massachusetts was present at Yorktown and wrote the account of the surrender. It was about 2 o'clock when the captive army advanced through the line formed for the reception. Every eye was prepared to gaze on Lord Cornwallis, the object of peculiar interest and solicitude. But he disappointed our anxious expectations. Pretending indisposition, he made General O'Hara his substitute as the leader of his army. This officer was followed by the conquered troops in a slow and solemn step, with shouldered arms, colors cased, and drums beating a British march. After General O'Hara surrendered, the British troops were directed to ground their arms. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their guns. Of course, as James Thatcher recorded, many of them were not happy about it. Some of the platoon officers appeared to be exceedingly chagrined when given the word ground arms. Many of their soldiers manifested in sullen temper, throwing their arms on a pile with violence, as if determined to render them useless. Although there was some fighting for a while after the Battle of Yorktown, the British soon decided that they could not keep up the fight. 6,000 soldiers had surrendered at Saratoga and another 7,000 at Yorktown. The British government did not have the money it would cost to replace those soldiers. Many British people had also grown very weary of the war. In September 1783, the British signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris. The Revolutionary War was over. The colonists had won their independence, and a new nation was formed, the Marquis de Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette was one of the first Europeans to volunteer to assist the colonists in their fight for independence. When he offered to help the colonists fight the British, he was told that no one could afford to pay him. Lafayette agreed to serve without pay. The King of France did not want Lafayette, a nobleman, to go off to war, but Lafayette was determined, even if it meant disobeying the king. He went so far as to purchase a ship to carry him to North America. Only 19 years old when he arrived, he quickly established himself as one of Washington's top generals in the Continental Army. Well, look at that, a turn of events for the good. America did come out on top, but you already knew that, didn't you? Because you've already studied this with your teacher. Don't forget to go into the Google Classroom and fill out your assignment for the day. I will see you back here tomorrow with Chapter 7, Heroes and Villains, and we will find out who exactly is our hero and who the villain is. Have a terrific Tuesday.